welcome to this second video in the series on who wrote the Qur'an. These videos are designed to be viewed in a sequence, so if you have not already watched When Was the Qur'an Completed Part 1, may I invite you to stop this video now and go and view that one first, and if you enjoyed it then please come back and embark on When Was the Qur'an Completed Part 2. In the previous video, I demonstrated that the Qur'an must have been completed no earlier than 630. In this video, we will be looking at when the Qur'an must have been completed before, in order to identify a period within which the Qur'an reached its final form. We start by looking at the radiocarbon dating of the earliest Qur'an manuscripts. The process of radiocarbon dating allows scientists to determine a period within which a formerly living organism has died. Since early Qur'ans were handwritten on parchment that was made from animal hide, normally goat, if we can identify the period when the goat in question died, we will normally be close to identifying the period when the manuscript was created. To the best of my knowledge, 9 manuscripts containing the text of the Qur'an have been radiocarbon dated and shown to have been written on parchments made from goats that died before 694. These are plotted on the chart that you see on the screen. In fact, 2 need to be disregarded. We start with the Sanar palimpsest, that's the yellow rectangle near the top of the chart. The nature of a palimpsest is that it is a writing surface upon which one text has been written, but which has then been erased or washed off, and then a second text has been added in its place. In the case of the Sanar palimpsest, although both the lower text that has been removed and also the upper replacement text consists of verses of the Qur'an, only the upper text matches the canonical Qur'an that Muslims use today. And because this must by definition have been added sometime after the parchment was first created, then unless it's possible to test the ink, we won't be able to find out scientifically when this was created. To be strictly accurate, we should also disregard the Chester Beatty manuscript, that's the green rectangle towards the bottom of the screen. This is because what was tested in that case was not the parchment upon which the actual Qur'an was written, but loose pieces of parchment that were found with it. This probably were part of the manuscript. However, out of an excess of caution, this also will be disregarded. This leaves 7 pre-694 Qur'an manuscripts. Now, the date we are interested in, of course, is the earliest, latest date, so to speak. That is the last possible date upon which any one of these could have been written. We move the chart along. Once Chester Beatty has been taken out of consideration, the earliest, latest date is the Birmingham manuscript, which was created between 568 and no later, the scientists tell us, than 645. Three objections are sometimes raised to this conclusion. Firstly, some doubt the accuracy of the testing method or the reliability of the conclusions. Well, it is true that measuring the decay of carbon-14 accurately relies upon knowing the ratio of carbon-14 to other chemicals in the atmosphere at the time when the animal in question died. This can be calculated in general terms, but one cannot exclude the possibility that specific factors may have affected a particular animal from which an individual manuscript was made. Against this, I would say that I'm following the best scientific evidence that there is available. When new evidence comes to light, I'm of course happy to revisit my conclusions. Secondly, although one manuscript has to be the earliest, in fact what we have here are 7 manuscripts that all seem to have been created at around the same time, and these results come from independent laboratories working quite separately. And thirdly, I think it is fair to say that there is a consensus within the professional Qur'an studying academia that these results are accurate, This is relying on people who are used to dealing with old manuscripts and who can take into account other factors such as writing styles. A second argument that is sometimes made is that testing like this can only determine when the parchment was created. It cannot ascertain when it was written on. In other words, these Qur'ans may be written or may have been written on old parchments. Well, this seems to me very unlikely. I see no reason why a parchment manufacturer would stockpile vast quantities, hundreds and hundreds of hides of parchment unused, in the hope that their children or grandchildren will be able to sell them decades or maybe 50 or 100 years later to people who wanted to forge old books. It seems to me very unlikely that that would happen. Also, I don't see any particular motive for a Qur'an manufacturer wanting his book to look particularly old. He could simply present it as an old text that's just been written down on a new document. It's not like forging a letter or a deed or something. The third possibility is that these Qur'ans, which are all partial Qur'ans, may have been edited. None of them are complete. In fact, the earliest dated complete Qur'an is dated 799, and even that is treated with some skepticism. So, is it possible that all these are original, authentic, 7th century Qur'an manuscripts, and yet the text has nevertheless been edited and bits added and bits taken out later on? In this chart, I have plotted which of the Qur'an's 114 surahs is evidenced on a pre-694 manuscript. Each of the grey rectangles represents one of the Qur'an's 114 surahs. If part of the surah is contained on a pre-694 parchment, I have shaded it light green. If the whole of the surah is contained on a pre-694 parchment, I have shaded it dark green. As you see, the vast majority of the Qur'an is contained on pre-694 manuscripts. In fact, it is perhaps surprisingly, it tends to be the surahs that are generally believed to be the earliest to be announced, i.e. those that fall towards the end of the Qur'an that tend not to be evidenced. There is certainly no pattern of the earliest surahs being on the oldest manuscripts and the later surahs not being there. The notion that these early Qur'an fragments may be accurately dated to the late 7th century, but that the text might have undergone later additions or later editing, is detracted from how similar these texts are to one another. Qur'an manuscripts are extremely similar. Every Qur'an manuscript that we have, with the exception of the Sanar palimpsest lower text, contains the same word order in the verses that they include, the same verse order in the surahs that they include, and the same surah order, and all manuscripts contain at least one instance of the end of one surah and being followed by the beginning of another. I highly recommend that everyone watching this, if they'd like to know a little more about it, watch Dr. Marin van Putten, one of the world's leading authorities on early Qur'an manuscripts, in an interview that has very recently been released called Live Talk, the Qur'an and Science, which is posted by Where Islam on their YouTube channel, dated the 30th of July 2021. To illustrate the point, Dr. Van Putten at one stage produces 2 sheets of early Qur'an manuscripts, and he says the following about them. I have taken here 2 manuscripts. One is a British Library manuscript, that's the one on the left, OR 2165, and on the right is a famous Birmingham fragment. And both of these contain about the same portion of the Qur'an, the end of Surah Maryam and the beginning of Surah Taha. You might wonder, how close are they? The answer for these manuscripts, at least, is very, very similar. So similar, in fact, that there is only one letter where these manuscripts differ at all. Ironically, it is in the word Al-Quran, which in the manuscript on the left is written without an alif, and on the right with an alif. Everything else is letter for letter identical, and that is by no means atypical. Now in 2019, Dr. Van Putten was able to make a major breakthrough in Qur'an studies when he appears to demonstrate beyond any doubt that all Qur'ans are descended from a single canonical archetype. He did this by examining the word nima, which means grace, as it appears in the phrases the grace of God, the grace of your Lord, and the grace of my Lord. In all these phrases, the word was sometimes written with the letter ta, that's the downward curve, and sometimes with what is called a ta marbuta, or a tied up ta, which appears like a little circle. Whichever symbol is used makes absolutely no difference to the word's meaning or to its pronunciation. As Dr. Van Putten says, such orthographic idiosyncrasies occur rather frequently in the Qur'an. When we find such variations in spelling, we must conclude that they carry no linguistic value as they express the exact same phrase with the same meaning. Such spelling variations, then, appear to have been attributable to the discretion of the scribe. If I were to give an example, if I were writing something in English and it involved the name of a company, let us say Smith & Sons, if I sometimes wrote it with spelling out the word and, Smith A-N-D, Sons, and sometimes using the ampersand, it would make absolutely no difference to the meaning of the text. It would make absolutely no difference to the pronunciation. The only way in which anyone would be aware of which I'd use would be by actually reading the document. Now, Dr. Van Putten has plotted on a chart each instance in which this phrase Nima Allah appears in an old manuscript, and this is a chart that he has produced. The letters or combination of letters and numbers along the top represent old Qur'an manuscripts. Some of them appeared in the chart that I showed in the first slide. The Q, for example, the second letter in, is the Kaf manuscript, which exists in Cairo. Roll forward a little bit further, you see a T, that is a Tübingen manuscript, that is the third oldest Qur'an in the world. The SU next to it is the upper text of the Sanar manuscript, and moving towards the end, second to the end, the B represents the Birmingham manuscript. In the column on the left, you see all the Qur'an verses in which this phrase appears. And in each instance in which the Qur'an verse appears on an old manuscript, Dr. Van Putten has noted whether it appears with a ta or a ta marbuta. Now, to make it a little clearer, I've added some coloured lines. So you see, for example, that in Surah 2, verse 211, you find that every instance the Qur'an manuscript uses a ta marbuta every time that it appears. However, in verse 2, 231 and 3, 103, it uses a simple letter ta. There seems to be a bit of a doubt about one of them, which is in brackets, but I don't think that affects our overall point. Surah 5, verse 7, and they are all ta marbutas again. Mr. Van Putten says in his article, there is an extremely strong correlation between the position of the idiosyncratic spellings in the Cairo edition, that is the Quran that everyone uses today, or most Muslims use today, and earlier Quranic manuscripts, with only two locations, Surah 16 verse 114 and Surah 37 verse 57, showing any disagreement at all. This great consistency cannot be attributable to chance. Well, I think that's absolutely self-evident. He says there is only one possible explanation for the strong agreement across the many different Quran manuscripts with the two possible spellings of Nimat. There must have been a single written archetype from which all Quranic manuscripts of the Uthmanic text type are descended. A second implication of these results is that from the very beginning of the text standardization, every single manuscript that belongs to the Uthmanic text type must have been copied from a written exemplar. It is exactly these kinds of orthographic idiosyncrasies that would be impossible to reproduce through a process of writing down from dictation. And if anyone wishes to read it, I highly recommend reading the article, which is freely available on the internet. It's called The Grace of God as Evidence for a Written Uthmanic Archetype, The Importance of Shared Orthographic Idiosyncrasies by Marion van Putten. Or if you like it in a slightly easier to digest format, as I say, I highly recommend looking at this talk that was posted on the Where Islam YouTube site on the 30th of July this year. Live talk, the Quran and science. Well, these variants show the great consistency in the Quran manuscripts. They also allow the construction of a stemma, showing how early manuscripts were copied one from another. For these purposes, I strongly recommend watching another video. It's called On the Regionality of the Quranic Codices, a philological and phylogenetic study, the history of the Quran text and transmission by Haytham Sidki. And this was posted first on the Collège de France website, but I believe it has now available on the YouTube as well. Haytham Sidki has compared the creation of variants through the hand copying of manuscripts to the mutation of DNA through reproduction. I shall let him explain. This is a passage from the video that I referred to. And there is actually a lot of similarities between evolutionary biology and between manuscripts, and in particular handwritten manuscripts. When DNA is copied, it's imperfect. Mutations happen. In the same way, when you copy a manuscript by hand, you can make some random mistakes. The key thing is that as these changes accumulate, you can track these inherited changes and try to reconstruct what we call a stemma in manuscripts, but an evolutionary tree. So we can take manuscripts and represent them in the same way that DNA point mutations are represented, and we can run an analysis. I should stress that although the early Quran manuscripts contain very many such variants, these are almost always of a minor and inconsequential nature, such as differences in spellings or the use of conjunctions or pronouns, where the meaning of the text is not in any doubt. There were approximately 40 frequently occurring variations in the early manuscripts that supports the traditional Islamic account of a single original Quran manuscript from which 4 copies were made and dispatched to separate locations, sometimes called the regional codices. Now this gives us 4 different writing traditions that are associated with geographical regions: Medina, Mecca, Kufa, Basra and Damascus. If I go through 5 out of the 40, I think I can make the point. In Surah 2, verse 116, most Quran manuscripts include that little curved letter that I've circled in red, which is a wa, and which means and. So they say, and they said. However, the Damascus writing tradition does not have this letter. For manuscripts from Damascus, it simply says, they said. It makes absolutely no difference to the wording of the Quran or the meaning of the Quran, but it does show that the regional codex that went to Damascus didn't have this letter in. In the case of Surah 2, verse 132, you see that the Medinan and the Damascus traditions both have an alif, which is missing from the Meccan, Kufan and Basran writing traditions. It makes absolutely no difference to the meaning, but again it tells us something about how these first manuscripts were copied one from another. Surah 3, verse 133, rather similarly to the first example, you see that the Meccan, the Kufan and the Basran all have that little letter wa, meaning and in the sentence and hasten, which is absent from the Medinan and the Damascus tradition. Surah 3 verse 184, you see there is a letter, a bar, which means with, that appears in the Damascus tradition and with scriptures instead of and scriptures. And finally, for now, Surah 4 verse 66, you see another alif appearing in the Damascus tradition that is not in any of the others. Now, even in these 5 examples, a certain pattern becomes clear. The Meccan, the Kufan and the Basran manuscripts in all of these 5 all have the same text. The Damascus is the most likely to be an outlier, most likely to go its own way, which it does in the 1st, the 4th and the 5th scenario. However, in the 2nd and the 3rd examples that I gave, 2.132 and 3.133, the Damascus tradition and the Medinan tradition agree with one another. So, from tracking these minor variations, we can say something, or I can't, but Dr. Haitham Sidki can say something about how these manuscripts were copied right at the very beginning. Haitham Sidki has analysed over 50 manuscripts in terms of their agreement to the 5 regional codices, and he's found a high level of agreement between them. He has produced this chart. This is in an article that was only published in July 2021. In this chart, you see down the left-hand side a list of Qur'an manuscripts, some of them beginning to look a bit familiar now. The second down is BL, that is the British Library manuscript that Dr. Van Putten was mentioning, and 2 below that is a Birmingham manuscript, which Mr. Van Putten was comparing the BL British Library manuscript to. A little further down you see Tub, which is the Tübingen manuscript, and 2 below that the CAF manuscript Q47 that I mentioned earlier on. Now, in many of these, they seem to fit 100% with the writing traditions that are associated with the regional codices. However, it's ones that are less than 100% in accordance that are possibly the most interesting. Those are 97% or 94% or 86% in agreement. Dr. Sidki has assessed 16 of these manuscripts as containing sufficient variance to construct a stemma from. And this is what he has produced. The M in the centre of the chart represents the Medinan regional codex, which may well be the original archetype. You see that there are 6 manuscripts that seem to be copied directly from that regional codex. You also see that there are 2 other regional codices that seem to be copied from it. The S, which is the Syrian, which I called the Damascus in my earlier chart, and you see that the British Library manuscript is descended from the Syrian writing tradition. You also see the B, which is the Basran, and 2 manuscripts are copied directly from the Basran regional codex, and then there is a second Basran codex, which Dr. Sidki refers to as B, or B+, and several manuscripts are copied from that. If you'd like to know more, I would recommend that you read the article. It's called On the Regionality of Quranic Codices by Haitham Sidki in the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association. However, I have to warn you that it's not free. It will cost you £15. For my purposes, it was well worth it, and I don't begrudge Mr. Sidki $15 for his hard work. So, what have we learned at the end of this? Since it appears that all Quran manuscripts are ultimately derived from a single canonical archetype, as Dr. Van Putten has shown by his analysis of the spelling of Nimat, and that from this archetype 4 regional codices were made, and that it is from these regional codices that all subsequent Qurans were copied including those manuscripts which we have radiocarbon dated to the second half of the 7th century, it is overwhelmingly likely that the entirety of the Qur'an consonantal text was fixed before the oldest radiocarbon tested manuscript was created. Put another way, if later Qur'ans had been made after the canonical archetype and the regional codices, with material changed and new material added, it is very unlikely that the scribes making the new Qur'ans would have copied out all the orthographic idiosyncrasies of earlier local editions. Surely they would have made a new, revised and approved Qur'an and then made all copies from that. But that is not what we find. We find that the early stemma can still be discovered by examining all these early manuscripts. It also seems fairly unlikely to me that a caliph would have been able to destroy every copy of a text once it had become widely circulating and treated as religiously important across a large territory, in this case stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. There is absolutely no doubt that early Qur'ans were destroyed and that only one was allowed to survive. But this must have taken place within a fairly confined group of people and a fairly restricted geographical area. By the time a text becomes out there, it's going to be very difficult to capture each individual one, especially when there's a strong motivation for devotees to try and preserve what they would see as religiously important and authentic texts from being corrupted. Since 7 manuscripts have been radiocarbon dated to before 694, and the earliest not later than 645, we reach our conclusion, which is that the Qur'an consonantal text was completed by about 645. In my first video, I concluded that the Qur'an could not have been completed any earlier than the year 630. I now form the conclusion that it could not have been completed any later than 645. This means that there is a fairly precise window, just 15 years long, within which the Qur'an must have reached its final completed form. Well, please consider liking if you did like it, subscribing, commenting, sharing, and following me on Twitter at Islam Research GP. And as with my earlier video, I shall be posting every slide that I use here for your ease of reference if you want to look up anything in particular. It only remains for me to say thank you for watching, and I hope you join me next week for another video. Having looked at when the Qur'an was completed, I shall now be moving on to where the Qur'an was written, and in particular producing the first part of what I call my Jerusalem thesis. So I look forward to joining you then. Bye bye.